Bonjour tout le monde. Au nom de l'Université d'Ottawa, I'd like to welcome you here. I am welcoming you on behalf of several organizations. Firstly, on behalf of the University of Ottawa. In particular, the Center for International Policy Studies, CIPS, and I encourage you to go to their website. It's a huge wealth of information. There's a great blog there which you can contribute if you feel that you have something to say. So on behalf of CIPS, I welcome you here. On behalf of the rest of the university too, the law faculty, which I belong to, and others, welcome. And on behalf of MEGS, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, I welcome you all to this very important, interesting event to celebrate the legacy of Raoul Wallenberg and what it means today. I'm going to ask my friend Kyle to come up and formally welcome everyone on behalf of MEGS too. Kyle?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Senior Deputy Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today at Ottawa University. I was in this room just last May for the Ottawa Forum, an important discussion on Canada's role in the world in the next 20, 30 years. It's always great to be back at Canada's really only bilingual university. Alors, merci beaucoup. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici. I'd like to start off by thanking Errol and the colleagues at CIPS for agreeing to partner with us today. Also, I'd like to thank the Embassy of Sweden in Ottawa and the World Economic Forum's Young Global Shapers community who have acted as promotional partners for today's event. We're meeting here today, as many of you no doubt, to realize 2014 is a period in time where, unfortunately, the commission of genocide and other mass atrocities seems to be a growing problem, not one just confined to one generation or one specific country. And it is somewhat a sobering time to think about what can individuals in and outside of government do to protect civilians from mass atrocity crimes. And it's in this, on this discussion that I really think it's important for us to gather and talk about Raoul Wallenberg, Canada's first honorary citizen, who has been recognized for his personal sacrifice, for doing the right and moral thing during the Second World War, for saving upwards to 100,000 Hungarian Jews from slaughter of many who then came to Canada and formed a very strong community of Wallenberg's children, is to think about, what are his lessons today? Can we be indifferent? No. Can we feel powerless? No. There are many things that one individual was able to save so many lives, and I think more than ever, I think his legacy really needs to be imparted upon a new generation of Canadians and youth around the world. My institute, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, works to be a catalyst for the prevention of mass atrocity crimes. We're an institutional partner of the Canadian All-Party Parliamentary Group for Prevention of Genocide. We've established the world's first professional training program for the prevention of mass atrocities, headquartered in Montreal. We're now entering our third year, where we've trained people from the United Nations, the Canadian government, the US government, and NGOs. And we're really a research center based in a university that believes that scholarly research should only stay in academia, but needs to be taken outside and shared with the wider community. So I'm very pleased that you've joined us today. We're going to proceed with two short opening remarks, starting with David Lunderquist of the Canadian Embassy, and followed by Vera Gara who's a Holocaust survivor. And will be followed by a panel discussion, which I'll chair with Paul Dewar, who's a member of Parliament and the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide. Also including Erwin Kotler, Member of Parliament for Montreal and former Justice Minister, as well as Errol Mendez of CIPS, Ottawa U's human rights hero of his own here in the Faculty of Law. So with further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to David of the Swedish Embassy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me thank Isadora Helgen and the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies for organizing this seminar, or this series of seminars, really, because there are similar panels and discussions held in New York and Toronto and Montreal during this month and next. And thank you also to the University of Ottawa for hosting today's panel. I'm honored to be invited here today, among such prominent guests, to say a few words about the most famous of my colleagues, Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, and why he matters today. Most of you know the story, I'm sure, of how Raoul Wallenberg was sent to the Swedish legation in Budapest in 1944 with a specific mission to save as many Jews as he could from deportation and almost certain extermination. He did this by issuing protective Swedish passports, by establishing Swedish safe houses, by confronting German officers, sometimes even as they were loading the trains with Hungarian Jews for deportation, and demanding they release or keep their hands off the people under his and Sweden's protection. The bravery and moral courage of Wallenberg and those who assisted him helped save tens of thousands of Jews. The Holocaust wasn't the first genocide in the bloody history of man, nor, I'm afraid, was it the last, but we can learn from it. We must learn from it. This attempt to exterminate a people, a whole culture, methodically and with chilling effectiveness, offers a unique lesson for us all. It's a reminder of what we humans are capable of at our worst, of how evil acts feed more evil, but also of how silence and inaction will feed evil. Raoul Wallenberg teaches us another lesson. He reminds us of what we are capable of at our best, of how speaking up and taking action can actually slow down the forces of evil and eventually stop them altogether. Wallenberg did not have to go to wartime Budapest and put his life at risk for others. He chose to. It was a dangerous mission and he knew it. He told his colleague at the Swedish legation, Per Anger, who later became the Swedish ambassador to Canada, by the way, he said, "To me, there is no other choice. I've taken on this assignment and I will never be able to go back to Stockholm without knowing inside me that I'd done all a man could do to save as many Jews as possible." This was the last conversation Wallenberg had with his colleague before he was arrested by the Soviet forces and disappeared. Wallenberg showed us that one man can make a difference. He chose not to be a bystander, not to surrender to the easy option of looking the other way. We need more individuals like Raoul Wallenberg. We need more courage and humanity. We need to celebrate those who stand up to cruelty and injustice. We need to tell their stories again and again, because courage, just as cowardice, is contagious. I'm proud to represent the same country as Raoul Wallenberg, but I'm not so proud of Swedish history concerning Wallenberg. The Wallenberg family was left too alone for too long. The Swedish government did not do enough to find out what really happened to this brave Swedish diplomat. There were many missed opportunities during the years after his disappearance to find out the truth. For a long time, we did not tell the story of Raoul Wallenberg. That was a mistake. I think we have learned our lesson, though. 2012 was the year when Wallenberg would have turned 100. To commemorate this, the Swedish government, together with the Swedish Institute and the Forum for Living History in Stockholm, produced an exhibition entitled, "To Me, There Is No Other Choice," telling the story about Raoul Wallenberg in museums and public venues in Sweden and abroad. This exhibition was on display in the Canadian War Museum in late 2012 and at the Toronto Reference Library in 2013. And the Swedish Embassy worked closely with the Jewish communities in Ottawa and Toronto, as well as with the Israeli and Hungarian embassies, to organize lectures, school visits, teacher seminars, and other activities in connection with the exhibition. And similar efforts were made in Sweden, where a Swedish version of the exhibition was touring and where students in high schools all over the country learned about and discussed the story of Raoul Wallenberg and how we can apply what he teaches us in our time and our society. The exhibition's last stop was in Brussels last fall, where it was on display in the European Parliament. Sadly, anti-Semitism is still alive in Europe. Populist political parties are growing in several European countries, including Sweden. In some cases, these parties have been allowed to shift the entire political map. Established parties have adapted to the intolerant messages. Those who support an open and tolerant society have been far too quiet. We've seen the patterns before. We cannot risk paying the price of doing nothing. As Europeans, as Democrats, as people deeply committed to human rights, we need to meet this challenge. Many of us know the following lines by German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller. First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. We cannot all be heroes like Raoul Wallenberg, but everyone can do something. We all have a responsibility to stand up against anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. By telling the story of Raoul Wallenberg and other heroes of humanity in schools, in public lectures, in museums, on screens, we can inspire others to bring out the courage that they have within them, that we all have within us. In my hometown of Malmö, in southern Sweden, there has been a rise in the number of Jews who have suffered anti-Semitic harassment through both verbal and physical assaults. Some Jewish families have even left the city. The rabbi of Malmö, Schneur Kesselman, has suffered over 70 anti-Semitic incidents in 1 year. As a reaction to the incident in Malmö, a group of engaged citizens took the initiative to gather at the synagogue in Malmö and walk in a procession through the town wearing kippas, the Jewish skull cap. They were making the point that citizens in Malmö should not have to be afraid to wear religious symbols such as the kippa or the Magen David, the Star of David, if they chose to. That the people of Malmö would not accept anti-Semitism in their city. This movement, the Kippa Walk, has since been repeated many times in Malmö, and it has spread to other cities in Sweden. The number of participants is steadily growing. Courage is contagious. I'm truly inspired by the engagement that institutions and individuals all over Canada continue to show in spreading the legacy of Raoul Wallenberg. Today's seminar is yet another example of that, and I very much look forward to listening to the presentations of the panelists and taking part in the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask Vera Gara to come to the front, please.
Good morning. Excuse me. Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel deeply honored to be asked to open the Raoul Wallenberg Legacy of Leadership project here in the nation's capital. To give you some background information about myself, I was born in Vienna, Austria, and in 1938, after the Anschluss, I escaped with my mother to Hungary. In 1944, the Nazis took control of the country and the deportation of the Hungarian Jews started. Within 3 months, all Jews outside Budapest, more than 500,000, were deported, the majority of them to Auschwitz, Birkenau. We were amongst them, but luckily for us, we were taken to Austria, to working camps. By the time Raoul Wallenberg arrived to Budapest, we were in Strasshof distribution camp to be taken to our first camp in Austria. I learned about Wallenberg and his heroic self-sacrifice in Budapest during the 60s and early 70s. I gradually learned of many people whom I personally knew. 3 of them in Ottawa were saved by him. I came with my family to Canada in 1970 and got involved with a number of groups such as B'nai Bris, Na'amat, and became the chairperson of Holocaust Committee for 8 years. During this time, the group decided to create a memorial for Raoul Wallenberg. We decided to get a street named after him in the capital city of Canada. I had the good luck to gain the full support of the late Bess Greenberg, wife of the founder of Mindor Group. She had approached the late Ben Franklin, then mayor of Nepean, for suggestion. A large park on Mount View Drive within a recent created subdivision was selected, and during August 1983, it was named Raoul Wallenberg Park, in the presence of several ambassadors, members of parliament, with a big turnout. 2 years later, an immigrant sculptor from Latvia, Ugo Drava, I approached him, and he was chosen then to make a beautiful statue in front of the park to represent the heroism and fate of Raoul Wallenberg. We were also able to plant 10 human rights trees behind the statue. Now, after more than 30 years, it also has a playground, many beautiful trees and benches. Nepean is now part of Ottawa, and the park is always well attended. My youngest granddaughter calls the park Bobby's Park. Bobby means grandmother in Jewish. It certainly makes me very happy and proud. I also had the good fortune to meet Per Anger, Raoul Wallenberg's right-hand man in Budapest, when he came to Ottawa to accept the honorary Canadian citizenship for Wallenberg in 1985. He was well known in Ottawa, being ambassador of Sweden to Canada until 1970. For the last 35 years, I go to schools and handle students about my experience in the camps, and I always tell them about Wallenberg and the other righteous Gentiles. Their help saved many 100,000 people from the Nazi murder machine. I shall finish my introduction not with Wallenberg, but with an example of an Austrian farmer family who could keep their humanity during those terrible years. We started our time in Nazi work camp system, Leutzendorf, a small village in Lower Austria, as forest workers. My mother approached a farmer family trying to buy some food for us to keep it a little bit better. They would not accept any payment, and they provided us with everything they could share. It was wartime. They had a young daughter, Mitchell. She became my friend. She had goats to look after. She did not have to give her milk up to the authorities, so she brought us the milk to the barn when it was dark and nobody could see her. She could have been killed helping Jews. They knew the risk they took. Jew friends were treated by the Nazis the same way as the Jews. Still, they helped us. They are still saying, today, after 70 years, we are still close friends. We did nothing. We just simply did what we should have done. We just shared what we had. A few years ago, I had met a couple of old friends. Most of them also lived through the Nazi camps. And somehow I told them the story of Mitchell and her family. They practically ordered me to write a book about our experience. There was a general agreement that the world should know about those who helped or saved only a few people. They also deserve all the honors and all our thanks. Ruth Latham, writer and teacher, helped me to write the book. It took us 2.5 years to finish. The book titled Least Expected Heroes of the Holocaust. Raoul Wallenberg stood up against the Nazi murderers and saved tens of thousands of lives, leaving us the legacy of one man who made all the difference. We should never forget it, and we should be ready to follow his example wherever a new evil appears. We should also remember the other thousands who saved or just helped a few, sometimes only one person's life. They are very much part of the Wallenberg legacy. They also stood up to the evil and risked their life to provide solace to the victims. We still do not know when, where, and why Wallenberg disappeared without a trace. Am I being overly optimistic in believing that one day in the near future this secret will be solved and a statue of him will be erected at the place of his death? That would be a true closure to his life and never explain disappearance. It would be a memorial to the hero of the 20th century. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of everyone in the room and associated with this event, I want to say thank you, Vera, for having the courage to talk about your experience and reminding us of that people that we live with day to day here in Canada are affected by what Wallenberg did so many years ago. So now, folks, we're going to move to the panel. So I'm going to ask our panel members, both Paul Dewar, Erwin Kotler, and Errol Mendes, to come take a seat. You can sit wherever you'd like. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So what's going to happen next is each of the speakers is going to have 10 minutes to make an opening statement, either from their chair where it's nice and relaxed or from the podium. It's really up to them. And then we're going to turn to a question and answer period with the audience. And we have to be out here by 1, but I think we have a lot of time ahead to discuss and get different viewpoints on what Raoul Wallenberg's legacy means in 2014. So on the program, I know we had you going first. Would you like to take the podium or sit to where you are now?
I'll rest here.
Okay.
First of all, thank you to our presenters. Great combination of really what the legacy of Raoul is from a diplomatic point of view, as well as from a personal history. And I think we're all moved by his story, but it really connects when we hear from both of you about what it means, someone who's, if you will, hopefully going down the same path as a diplomat, but also someone who understood how meaningful it is to have people act on behalf of others, and people who understood at the time there was just one thing to do, and that was to do the right thing. And thankfully, that happened, and you're here to share that story. I also have to say, it is incredible the work you've done here in our city, that you have touched so many young people, that you have carried on the narrative and the importance of it, because as we all are concerned, as time goes on, sometimes that story, we're all concerned that the story is not given the importance that it should, but you do such an exceptional job, and I also want to acknowledge your husband here, who's been part of that and supporting you. So thank you so much for what you've done. it is important for all of us. And I want to just talk a little bit about what I see. And I was asked to join Senator Dallaire when I was first elected to form this all-party group for the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity. And as a new MP, I was entirely intimidated, but I knew that I only had one choice, and that was to say yes to Senator Dallaire. And what he was trying to do was to take the whole issue of what we had hopefully learned in our respective histories here in Canada and around the world, to bring that together, not from a partisan perspective, but from a perspective of saying, look, what have we learned and how ultimately do we prevent these calamities, catastrophes, these horrific human rights abuses? And so I jumped in, and I'll have to tell you that the most meaningful experiences I've had has been through my work with that all-party group. And I say that because it really did enlighten me. It showed me that there's opportunities for parliamentarians to work together. We've, since the group was formed, been able to work across party lines on really important initiatives. We've been able to inform. The most important thing, I think, on this issue, and touching on what our presenters shared with us, is to educate and to deal with ignorance and to make people understand that there are things that can be done. Because this is a heavy issue. I don't know of any other issue that you can think of that is as heavy as this. And sometimes it just weighs you down and you think, well, it's too big, it's too hard. But what this all-party group and the inspiration of Senator Dallaire, who had viewed what had happened in the UK, where the first all-party group for the prevention of genocide was created, was to say, no, this is a role for parliamentarians to understand, obviously, what's happened in the past so that we can prevent it in the future. And I'm not sure we've done as well as we hope in terms of prevention, but we've kept it live as an issue. And it's meant that colleagues like Mr. Kotler and others have been able to take their rich experience, and obviously a lot more experience than I, and share it with colleagues to bring in others and to have partnerships to say, look, in 2014, we know there are hot spots, there are places that are vulnerable. We just heard about recently in Hungary. I brought this up in the House about the rise of what I call old-fashioned, some would say, but just direct anti-Semitism. That is, just what we saw back in the 30s. And, that we together can help inform each other to say, look, if we're going to have informed debate and look at prevention, then we have to look at what are the tools that we can use to help us deal with that. So one of the things that I want to touch on, and maybe this will help us open up the discussion a bit, is what R2P means in 2014, responsibility to protect or the will to intervene. There's been a lot of discussion, debate, some controversy about how it's been appropriated by some, misunderstood by others, but I think from my own point of view, and certainly something we brought forward from our party's perspective, I think it's shared also by Mr. Kotler's party, is that we should be working with other countries on focal points. And what has happened in innovation in the whole R2P area is to have countries have focal points appointed to keep an eye on where the hotspots are, where there is potential for massive human rights abuses and or potential genocide, and share information and have diplomatic assets appointed to do that. So no longer just a policy. The policy is important, but what does that mean? And the focal point, innovation, is really important. We've seen so many countries come on board with it, and it's something our country hasn't gone on board with yet. We keep pushing, and just as a recent history, when we had the commemoration of the Rwandan genocide, we had an all-party motion to commemorate the Rwandan genocide, and we did try and get that into the motion, working together, colleagues. Sadly, it didn't go forward, but there was an attempt there. And I really hope to see that come forward. Why? Simply because it's something that's being done at the multilateral level right now, where countries are assigning diplomatic assets to keep an eye on what's happening in the world, the hotspots, the potential atrocities, and then share information. And this is incredibly important because we know, Canada can't solve all the problems itself. We know that. I mean, the debate we're having right now in Iraq, or the whole issue around Ebola in West Africa. We have to work together in this multipolar world. And if we're going to do the right thing, if we're going to prevent mass atrocities, if we're going to ensure we learn the lessons of the past, we have no choice but to work together. And that's a hopeful thing. And when we despair about what's going on in the world, and there's a lot of despair these last number of months, I see that as a very hopeful thing, because I know that there are so many people committed, and I have to cite the work that Migs is doing. Kyle, thank you for the work you've been doing in training people, because people are wanting to be involved. They want to make a difference, if you will, the example of Mr. Wallenberg. Because it's one thing to despair, but there's another thing to take action. And training people in this area of identifying where there are hotspots and there are potential mass atrocities, and there is vulnerabilities for massive populations, requires a lot of people doing a lot of important work. And this is something, again, I'll touch on as the innovation here. Civil society has an inordinate amount of capacity that needs to be leveraged more. And that means universities, that means obviously governments, that means institutions working together. And that means reaching out, as Migs have done, to train people up. And I'll share one story to kind of finish off. This past week was a very sad week for me. A very good friend of my family, Norm Pollowin, died. And he, along with Ruth Pollowin and Ruth Sullivan, taught me the story from a very personal point of view of the Holocaust. Because Ruth and her family had not only survived Nazi tyranny, but escaped the Soviet tyranny as well. And I reflected a lot after the funeral and about what was happening, what they taught me. And I had those thoughts in my mind when I was just in the grocery store. And a young man came up to me and said, "You're Paul Dewar?" And I said, "I am." And he said, "Good to see you." And he had done the training with Migs. And it just connected those two things, the passing of a very, very good friend of my family's, who had survived and lived in hope and carried the flame of hope with their families. And then this young person coming up to me just when I was in thoughts and melancholic thoughts about Norm and Ruth and the family. And he just gave me a little spark, because he was just an everyday person who decided to take up the opportunity to be trained in this very important area. And if I can just push one thing, is that this is an issue, prevention of genocide, mass atrocities, and the legacy of Wallenberg, is something that we need to work together on to keep that flame bright, because there are people in this world who are counting on us. And if we're not there for them, who will be? And whether you are a minority in northern Iraq, or you are someone who is in Central Africa, or you are someone who is presently suffering anti-Semitism again in parts of Europe, they need us to be there for them, because that is the idea of human solidarity. And that's why I'm so passionate about this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. I'm glad you mentioned university, because the university has a role in all of this, because Nelson Mandela once said, that education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. And right now, I'm going to hand the mic over to someone who once represented Nelson Mandela and is also a former university professor, or perhaps a university professor as politician. Here you go, Erwin. Okay.
I'm going to use the podium. I respect more Paul for sitting, but with me, my adrenaline will allow me to move better this way. I also want to say that I really almost need not speak because I agree with everything that Paul said. I think that this is an exercise in the all-party collaboration of which Paul has spoken, and I want to commend him for his initiative and chair of the all-party group, which is perhaps one of the most important, though lesser-known, initiatives that we have in the Canadian Parliament. I also want to join Paul in paying tribute to Vera. There's no substitute for that compelling witness testimony. And to David for being really an inspirational presence in the Swedish embassy and on this particular issue all these years, and for your moving acknowledgement this morning also of both the failings of the Swedish government over the years, read the Raoul Wallenberg, other governments as well, and for what needs to be done to properly remember and act upon his legacy. And to Kyle, I want to say that we wouldn't have this initiative at the 4 universities that we have were it not for your inspiration and for MIG's organization and for the supporting partners. So this is what it takes to bring an effective program together. And as it happens, we meet at an important moment of remembrance and reminder, of bearing witness and taking action. We meet on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the Shoah of the Holocaust of Hungarian Jews, where some 600,000 Hungarian Jews, 3/4 of the population of Hungarian Jewry, were murdered in 1944. And it is also the 70th anniversary of the rescue by Raoul Wallenberg of the remnant of Hungarian Jews, the disappeared hero of the Holocaust who demonstrated what sometimes is a cliche, but in his case was a manifest act of heroic leadership, who demonstrated that one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, can resist, and can thereby transform history. To Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi desk murderer who organized the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews to the death camps in 1944, Raoul Wallenberg was, as Adolf Eichmann described him, Judenhund Wallenberg, the Jewish dog Wallenberg. To those who Wallenberg saved, and I've had the privilege of meeting many of them over the years in different countries, including here in our own in Canada, Wallenberg was the guardian angel. And so on this anniversary of anniversaries, it's also the 20th anniversary of that unspeakable genocide in Rwanda. I say unspeakable, not only because of the horror of the genocide, but because the genocide was preventable, and nobody could say that we did not know. And so on this anniversary of anniversaries, I just want to link up with what Paul Dewar said, which is, you know, what have we learned? And no less important, what is it that we can do, whether we are members of parliament, whether we are academics, whether we are students, whether we are media, what is it that we can do individually and collectively as all members of civil society in our respective capacities, and where is R2P in all this? Because our primary coming together in terms of the generic lesson is how do we combat, I would say, more important, how do we prevent mass atrocity and the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide. And so what I'm going to do is to link up with Paul's framing of the issues for us, is to try to summarize some of those lessons and the corresponding action that needs to be taken. And the first lesson, and I'm going to use the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, whose anniversaries we are effectively commemorating in Hungary, Wallenberg and Rwanda now, as case studies for these lessons. And the first lesson is really the danger of forgetting and the importance, I would say, the responsibility of remembering. Le devoir de mémoire, the duty of bearing witness to unspeakable horrors on the one hand, and the collective failure to act which made them possible on the other. And more, that the Holocaust of Hungarian Jews and the mass murder of 1 million Rwandans, I mean, it's staggering to recall that 10,000 Tutsis were being murdered every day for 3 months. And it was not unknown that it was happening at the highest levels of the international community, which was effectively a bystander community. Their deaths were not a matter of abstract statistics, for as one says at such moments of remembrance, unto each person there's a name, each person is an identity, each person is a universe. And as we are taught, and you can find this in the Talmud, and you can find this in the Quran, that if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. But if you kill a single person, it is as if you have killed an entire universe. And so the first abiding lesson, and lesson for R2P, is really the notion that we are each, wherever we are, the guarantors of each other's destiny. And this brings me to the second enduring lesson from the Rwandan genocide, and I would say also not unlike the Holocaust. And that's the danger of state-sanctioned cultures of hate and the corresponding responsibility to prevent as a linchpin of the responsibility to protect. Simply put, the Rwandan genocide occurred not only because of the machinery of death, but because of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. As the Supreme Court of Canada recognized, echoed by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, I quote, "The Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words." And as the jurisprudence of the Rwandan tribunals demonstrates, these acts of genocide were preceded by and anchored in a state-orchestrated demonization and dehumanization of the Tutsi population, in the same way that you had a demonization and dehumanization of the Jews. I recently, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the Hungarian Holocaust, I was in Auschwitz-Birkenau together with Cecilia Alberg, the grandniece of Raoul Wallenberg. We were both invited there to speak, to light a memorial candle, and we went through the barracks and the displays there. And you know, sometimes nothing substitutes for seeing that witness testimony. And as it said here, from 1941 to 45, 1.3 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. And then you see screenings of what was said preceding the killing of the 1.1 million. Then the notion of the Jew as the embodiment of the devil, as the ultimate enemy of humanity, and the like. And it began in 1924 with Hitler's first statements and continued thereafter. There too, nobody could say that we did not know. You know, in Hungary, Nuremberg race laws were adopted in 1938. In 1941, 20,000 Hungarian Jews were then deported. So this was happening before we got to 1944. And so the importance of the responsibility to prevent and acting early and effectively. And we should recall an important decision made by our Supreme Court in the Mugesera case, which said that incitement to genocide is a crime in and of itself, regardless of whether acts of genocide follow. And so the importance of this second lesson with regard to R2P and the combating and preventing of mass atrocity and genocide is the fact of combating the genocidal incitement to begin with. The third lesson, and moving quickly, is really the danger of indifference and the consequences of inaction, and therefore the corresponding responsibility to act and protect. I mentioned Rwanda. One also can say the same thing, and it's the 10th anniversary of the genocide in Darfur, where the killing fields, are still continuing. And here too, nobody could say then we did not know, or say now that we do not know. Or in terms of Syria, which had one of the most peaceful beginnings of any Arab Spring country in March 2011, where young people began simply with what they called their peace and dignity protest. And then they were disappeared and subsequently tortured, and when others came to protest, they were gunned down, and then the mass killings began. And those of us who, after 1 year in Syria, there were less than 10,000 killed, there's more than, at this point, 200,000. Those of us who called then for the application of the R2P principle, because this was the time for this protective principle to be implemented. And there are a variety of things that can be done, from humanitarian relief to safe zones, refugee protection, and the like. We're told, well, if we intervene, that will bring about a Syrian civil war, sectarian strife, jihadists will come in. There were no jihadists at the time, I want to mention. Everything we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we didn't intervene. Everything that we were told would happen if we acted happened because we did not act and remained indifferent to a horrific killing field, which continues as we meet today, but also goes unaddressed and sometimes even unacknowledged. The whole is set forth with regard to this third lesson. You have to read Samantha Power's powerful and painful book on the problem from hell, America in the Age of Genocide, where you see the indifference of the US, I hate to say, as well as the international community, going back to the Armenian genocide of 1915 and continuing through Rwanda, the Holocaust, Darfur, and the like. And the fourth lesson is the danger of a culture of impunity, and therefore the corresponding responsibility to bring the mass perpetrators to justice. Just as there cannot be any sanctuary for hate, nor refuge for bigotry, there can't be any haven or sanctuary for the perpetrators of the worst crimes against humanity. A fifth lesson is the danger of the powerless and the powerlessness of the vulnerable. The brutalized children, the violated women, the targeted racial, religious, and ethnic minorities, all the first victims of mass atrocity crimes. And so it's our responsibility to empower the powerless while giving voice to the voiceless. And the test of a just society, it includes democracies like Canada with regard to our own domestic policy, is how does it treat the most vulnerable amongst it. Which brings me now to a sixth lesson, and moving to a close. And that is that the genocide was made possible not only because of the bureaucratization of genocide, as Robert Lifton put it in referencing Adolf Eichmann in that regard, but because of la trahison d'éclair, because of the betrayal of the elites, including physicians, church leaders, judges, lawyers, engineers, architects, educators, and the likes. In other words, Nuremberg crimes and Holocaust crimes were the crimes of the Nuremberg elite. Perhaps one other lesson that we ought to remember is not only the danger of being bystanders, but the responsibility to remember those who did not allow themselves to be bystanders and who acted. Those like Raoul Wallenberg, who remind us of the range of humanity that prevailed in the face of evil. And I find it a terrible tragedy, which does not speak well of us, that the person who saved so many was not saved by so many who could. And now, at this point, the very least we can do is to try to determine what in fact happened to Raoul Wallenberg, to get at the truth. That truth lies with present-day Russia. They are the keepers of the smoking gun, and it's time for Russia to open up this blank spot of history so that we can determine the true fate of Raoul Wallenberg, and that is the least that we can now do with respect to providing a semblance of justice to him after the enormous heroism that provided and saved so many lives. And so, to conclude, and perhaps Vera's presence reminds me of this and others here, we need always to remember and pay tribute to the survivors. Survivors of the Holocaust, survivors of the Rwandan genocide, those who endured the worst of inhumanity, the worst of mass atrocities and crimes against humanity, and somehow found in the resources of their own humanity the will to go on to rebuild their lives as they contributed to the building of our own communities and our own country here in Canada and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Oren. You're going to take the podium? Errol, it's over to you.
Well, what's there left to say after these wonderful presentations? But perhaps in honor of Vera and David and Erwin's mention about the power of individuals and Paul's, the only thing that perhaps one can start with is actually to give you the real moving experience of Raoul Wallenberg himself. So if you can put on it's about 5 minutes. I may have to cut it short given the time that I have, but perhaps you can see for yourself the power of one that he played.
The power of one. One person who recognizes injustice and acts to stop the evil. This was Raoul Wallenberg. His name is synonymous with compassion, selflessness, and courage. The type of anti-hero that movies are made of, standing up for the underdogs of the century. When much of Europe shook with fear at the Nazi war machine, Wallenberg fought back, armed with only his iron will and his determination to do good. Since taking power in 1933, the Nazis had advanced from country to country. For Jews, Nazi control meant abuse, torture, and murder in virtually every community, threatening the very existence of the Jewish people. To many, it seemed that Hitler was unstoppable. In March 1944, Hitler invaded Hungary and deported some 450,000 Hungarian Jews from the countryside, most to their death. In Budapest, more than 200,000 Jews awaited the same fate. The Swedish government and the American War Refugee Board searched for a representative to defend the Jews of Budapest. Raoul Wallenberg's name topped the list. Besides his reputation for initiative and achievement, Wallenberg was worldly. He had studied in the United States and had witnessed firsthand the calamity the war was causing throughout Europe. He had also worked in Haifa, where he befriended Jews who had escaped Nazi Germany.
So here comes this Swedish gentleman from a distinguished family and is willing to risk his life. And And that gives one back some of this feeling that maybe we are worth saving.
When Wallenberg arrived in Budapest in July 1944, he jumped into action, issuing thousands of protective passports, Schutzpass, with the Swedish seal, giving Jews the status of Swedish citizens and a way out of the country.
They separate us and forced us into the wagons, just a second before the train should start. Wallenberg appeared and yelled into every wagon, "If you possess a Schutzpass, you can immediately come out."
Operating from the Swedish embassy with some 300 volunteers, Wallenberg established safe houses under Swedish protection in which hundreds of Jewish families lived out the war in the midst of Nazi occupation. Some survivors tell of Wallenberg placing divers at the banks of the Danube to stealthily rescue Jews who had been pushed to their death by Nazis from the bridges above. Wallenberg's particular genius was for saving lives. Through his bold action, tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews survived. Under constant personal threat by the Nazis, Wallenberg carried on, thinking not of himself, but of a better future. Long before the outcome of the war was certain, he drew up a post-war reconstruction plan that would help ensure the continuity of the Jewish people.
I am here, and so are my children and my grandchildren, because of him. Only because of him. He gave me my life.
At the close of the war, Wallenberg was arrested by the Russians. According to some, he died from a heart attack in Lubjanka prison in 1947. Others say he was executed. Some reports say that Wallenberg languished far longer in Soviet captivity, perhaps even to this day.
Persecution does not just happen to Jews, so we must continue the story of Wallenberg to spread the inspiration and courage to do something about it.
Wallenberg didn't ask what needed to be done. He didn't need a decision-making process in the face of evil. He showed that we are all able to meet a challenge.
In every generation, great individuals have come forward to provide us with a moral compass, to teach us how to take action by their own selfless example. Our troubled future calls out for others to come forward, to take their place beside Raoul Wallenberg. The power of a single individual, unfettered by apathy, undeterred by fear. The power of one, who, in caring and acting, made all the difference.
One reason why I wanted to show you that is to tell you basically the same message that the others are giving you, but also to give you perhaps a more pessimistic note. And I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, because what we have seen with Raoul Wallenberg, even though he managed to achieve what he did, the cards were stacked against him. And in doing research on genocide and crimes against humanity, on several of the books and articles I've written, I've always come across how the most powerful individuals in the world seem always to try and take on and defeat the power of one. And unless society tries to understand that, I'm afraid that the power of one may not be powerful enough to overcome the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity. And let's start, okay, with a brief history lesson. Hitler probably would have won the war. We would have had a different world today if Roosevelt had decided to remain isolationist. He actually took on many of the isolationists in the United States, including JFK's father, to try and essentially convince the American people to enter the war. And he did that in a very important event which we tend to forget, which took place just off the coast of Newfoundland in Placentia Bay, when the Atlantic Charter between Churchill and Roosevelt finally created the inspiration for America to enter the war. The famous words in the Atlantic Charter, that they would create a world free of fear and want. And that was the beginning of the United Nations and the institutions of global governance. But what we forget in that history is that there was a commitment to keep human rights on the same level as state sovereignty. And that was soon forgotten. It was forgotten in the actual drafting of the United Nations Charter, where the first draft, something which I was stunned to discover, did not contain any mention of human rights. It was only because, again, the middle powers, not Canada, but some of the other middle powers, South Africa, Australia, etc., insisted that there would be some mention of human rights in the United Nations Charter, that we had the beginnings of the many starting to come to the support of the one, like Wallenberg. And we see, for example, going into history more, that there was another lone individual who decided to take on those who wanted to suppress human rights in the United Nations Charter in the cause of state sovereignty. And that was Eleanor Roosevelt, together with a former colleague of Irvin Cotler's, who we also tend to forget in terms of looking at history, Canadian history, John Humphreys, who basically was the drafter, in my view, because I have a copy of the first draft, which he gave me, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there again, Eleanor Roosevelt herself was ordered by the State Department to downplay the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was only because her championship, and those of John Humphreys and others, that ultimately she predicted, and it came true, that the Universal Declaration would become a Magna Carta of the world. Now, moving forward again, we see, for example, to quote Owen's talk again, that there was, and again to quote Shakespeare, how the power of individuals to try and stop genocides, to stop crimes against humanity, was often, to quote Shakespeare, when the pale cast of thought was sicklied over because of the lack or the fear of action. And so, for example, we look at the Bosnia, we look at Rwanda, we look at Kosovo, we look at now Syria. Oftentimes, it is individuals who had the power to act, who waited until, in the case of Bosnia, 200,000 people died, until the massacre, the genocide of Srebrenica happened, until we see later on in Rwanda, where Clinton, even after he recognizes his mistake, when he saw the image in Mogadishu of a white soldier being dragged through the streets on October the 3rd, 1993, he decided, even though he had information from his intelligence agencies, they actually gave him numbers as to how many people would actually die if Dallaire didn't get his 5,000 men. The CIA apparently gave figures as much as 500,000 people would be killed if Dallaire didn't get his 5,000 men, and yet nothing was done. So again, we see the power of one, the power of Eleanor Roosevelt, faced with the inability of those who had the power to intervene, who failed to act. We see again with General Dallaire, the power of one who desperately tried to act and was faced with inaction by none other than Clinton and also a future Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who received his telegram asking for 5,000 men, and he failed to pass it on to the Security Council. So the lesson which I think we should be learning from many of the histories that we should be studying is, yes, the power of one, but they need your help. Every single one of them, when they come, as Eleanor Roosevelt demonstrated, she decided to go over the heads of the State Department, go over the heads of the states who opposed this Universal Declaration, and went to the middle powers, went to civil society and said, I need your help. Let's make this something which they cannot ignore. And that's the message which I'm trying to give you today. Yes, the power of one, but the odds are stacked against them today. And I learned that firsthand last year, when I visited Myanmar. And I was shocked. I mean, I'm still recovering from it, because I thought I was going to a land of hope. The junta had decided to turn 180 degrees and become democratic. And I was hoping, I was on a mission with the International Commission of Jurists to meet some of the top leaders. I met with the Attorney General of Myanmar. And just before I was about to shake his hand, someone pulled me aside and said, I guess you should know about this man. I said, what should I know about this man? He said, he was the Governor General of Rangoon when the student uprising happened, and he was responsible for 3,000 students being massacred. I said, and I'm going to shake his hand? And I did, because I remembered what Jimmy Carter said and what General Dallaire himself said about shaking the hands. But then, when I asked to go outside Rangoon, I was told, you can't go because especially to the Muslim province of Rakhine State, because some of the people who knew what was going on there was telling me a genocide is unfolding. How many of you know that? The media doesn't talk about it. No one talks about it. There is a potential genocide unfolding in Myanmar right now, where the million-odd Muslims are being herded into essentially what looks like camps, where they're denied medicine, they're denied access to supplies, and the world is doing nothing about it. Yes, we should deal with Syria. Yes, we should deal with the potential genocides that ISIS is giving there too. But if we are true to the power of one, civil society has to be aware that there are similar events happening all over the world, and unless they come to the support of the one, the same thing is going to happen over and over again. So I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but I'm urging you in all the things that you do and are able to act, is to look around the world and see where the power of one, the people who are trying to make a difference, and come to their support. It could be no more, no less than basically saying, how can I help? How can I help you raise funds? How can I help you bring to the public more knowledge about what's happening in Myanmar? And unless that happens, yes, we should celebrate and understand the legacy of the one, but at the same time, we should do everything in our capabilities and abilities to help the future powers of one. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Errol. So everyone, we now have approximately, give or take, about 40 minutes for questions and answers. But we have actually two microphones, one in the center aisle and one on the left. So if anyone has a question, I'd ask you to walk to the microphone. Please mention your name, and if you're affiliated with an institution or a university or an organization, please say what that is, and keep your question to a question rather than a very long commentary. Yes, sir.
I worked as a research analyst in international conflict since the 60s on the North Island, North Island, don't do much. Just very briefly, in a few seconds, there is aspects which still need improvement. Many atrocities are ignored. We cannot make the argument we heard in Clinton years, we have to focus on some and forget the others. 3 cases, just to conclude: Papua, West Papua, Indonesia is committing horrific atrocities since 1963, including sterilizing the women, colonizing territory. I'll move briefly to the southern part of the North Sudan, which was supposed to be reunited with the free part of southern Sudan, and it didn't. That include Abyei, Nuba Mountains, southern Kordofan, Brunei, horrific things. The atrocities started in 1955. Somehow, no attention there. And finally, the rise of the extreme right since the late 70s, which started to flourish after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, centered amongst the defeated powers of World War II. We heard in the last few months slogans such as Hamas, Hamas, the Jews to the gas. The Roma are being hunted again. Hatreds in the eastern part of Central and Middle Europe start to look very much as they looked in the 30s and 40s. It's vast as a war with pride. Streets are named with collaborators with the Nazis and so on and so forth. I think the response is still weak and selective. Thank you very much.
So who on the panel, we're talking about the rise of right-wing parties in Europe, what about Sudan as well as Indonesia? Anyone who on the panel would like to take the first stab at either one of those questions?
Maybe if I could just start on Sudan. Just on Sudan, this is very troubling as we saw the formation of the new country of South Sudan. I'm the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We actually had a, not a very in-depth, it was a short study on what Canada's response should be and some of the concerns going forward. And as jubilant as people were with the creation of this new country and people have fought for, there were many warning signs about, and Scott already touched on in terms of Darfur, but other disputed areas that there clearly was no resolution and that we had to be vigilant and we had to put resources in. And if there was one failure, there's many failures, but the one failure that we all collectively responsible for with the creation of the new country of South Sudan was understanding that the importance of institution building of governance. And if you don't have institutions and governance, then you can't protect human rights. And you will see the deterioration of human rights into what we're seeing now, and we're collectively ignoring it. The situation, not just in Darfur, but as was mentioned in other parts. And so you'll see, if you go up on the hill, about 3 or 4 days out of the week, a couple of women who are Sudanese Canadians standing with signs saying, "Don't forget us." And I'm sad to say, I think we have. We've moved on. We think, there's a country, everyday people. The country has been created, and this is, good news. While we know it's a civil war, we know that minority groups are being affected, and that we didn't actually do what I think was our job collectively, and that was to support the institution building and creation of the new country and ensure that those minority groups were going to be protected. And I think that's something that we need to circle and give voice to.
I think everyone needs that.
Go ahead.
Just on Sudan, when I was at the International Criminal Court and the arrest warrant was issued against President al-Bashir, there was an outcry against having a head of state being charged with all the things that have been mentioned. But the thing that shocked me when I looked at some of the background information to that, the role of the global financial institutions, the most powerful weapon that could be used against Khartoum, the president of Sudan, and his gang of thugs, really, who basically were hell-bent on not only destroying Darfur and attempting to destroy the South, but even if the South became independent, to undermine them as they're trying to do right now. At the same time, to my horror, I discovered that the IMF and the World Bank was actually giving Sudan high marks for their macroeconomic performance. And that could have ended up being the most powerful weapon against Sudan to bring down that government. And no one was saying anything about it. So my message is, again, get knowledge as to who has the power, who has the weapons to bring down some of these people, and why are they not using it?
I think that the examples brought up are very compelling. I'm just going to use two, the South Sudan, because we've been talking about, and the other one that was brought up by Errol Menez, and that is the question of Myanmar. On the Sudan issue, there are two issues which repeat itself there. Not only the matter of racism and the dangers of incitement, but also the culture of impunity. Ahmed Haroun was indicted by the International Criminal Court for his participation in war crimes, crimes against humanity in Darfur. Rather than be brought to justice, he was actually rewarded by the Sudanese government, and later was involved and still involved in the participation of that triangular assault on the Nuba Mountains people, the triangular assault that has taken place with regard to the Blue Nile region, South Kordofan, etc. Ahmed Haroun has been implicated there. So 10 years later, the culture of impunity continues to reign, as it did with President, and does with President al-Bashir, as mentioned by Errol. And this brings me to another important point with regard to Myanmar. The Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights, on which I sit there as Vice Chair. I'm mentioning this also parenthetically because we are having hearings today on ISIS, which begin at 1 p.m., so I hope you'll understand if I leave at 20 minutes to 1, because I've got to preside there. But I want to mention on Myanmar, we have held hearings on what is going on in Myanmar. We've had witness testimony from the Rohingya groups and others. The thing that disturbs me is that even though we advised the media to come and hear the witness testimony and report about, not one Canadian media came and reported. We held a press conference not all party, I might add, not one Canadian media person came and reported. So there is a responsibility of the media here, and regrettably, by their absence, they themselves become, I don't want to say complicit, but act as a form of bystander as well, because they are not undertaking their own responsibility to report. And this is something that, you know, I have to say that the all-party group that Paul chairs is a model of a kind of a parliamentary all-party committee on mass atrocity prevention. Our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee is actually one of the few committees that actually works in a very collaborative fashion. We have issued report after report, which frankly goes, as I say, not only unacknowledged, but even unnoticed, including a report that we made, it's now close to 5 years, where we, as a matter of a finding of fact and conclusion of law, said that incitement to genocide is a crime in and of itself. This was a unanimous report, all parties of our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on National Human Rights, no reporting on it at all in the media.
Anything on the crimes in West Papua since 1963? Thank you.
You mentioned, you know, 3 case studies, and very importantly, we have made reference, not sufficiently. We did have 1 witness on that, but we will return to that. And that's another part of the problem is, you know, how do we address the various killing fields and mass atrocities being committed. And thank you for bringing that to our attention, and we will seek to hold a hearing on that, and I commend you for not only reminding us, but ensuring that we act on it.
See, one of the challenges of actually having 2 sitting MPs on a panel is that sometimes there are hearings at Parliament Hill, and we might lose them earlier than expected. So I'm going to ask, since we're going to be breaking a little bit earlier than originally planned, I'm going to ask all 3 of you there to actually present your questions in order so that we can go through them as fast as possible. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Luke, and I'm a student here at the Faculty of Laws and Law section. And my question goes back to the prevention of genocide. And I wanted to ask if denial is a way to combat against denial is a way to fight genocide or prevent genocide. For example, the Holocaust. Who would have imagined that the Holocaust would have any deniers? It's an undeniable fact. Also, the Armenian case. Undeniable fact, a lot of proof, but yet state-sponsored denial. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Anita McLean, and I had the fortune of working with Per Anger, the Swedish ambassador, when he was here. And that's the same time when he was writing his book, and the movie was made of it. And anyway, I then, last year, I visited the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And I was there with a group. We had a guide, took us around for 2.5 hours, and this guide never mentioned Raoul Wallenberg. And that made me quite upset. And I asked the administration, how could this happen, and so on. Well, I was just told, well, there is a tree in his honor. But to me, I wonder if there's anybody from the Israel embassy here I'd like to complain, make that complaint, because to me, he should have a much bigger memory, the Israeli people especially. And he also mentioned the fact, so that's like a question to the Israel embassy in a way. But I also have another question, and that's, or you're talking about how important it is for an individual to speak up. We did visit the West Bank too, and I'm afraid there are lots of human rights breaches going on there too. So I don't know if you have any comments about that.
My name is Randall Whiteside. I'm also a student at the University of Ottawa. And you were talking about the need for this direct action to be taken against these places. where genocides or human atrocities are occurring. And my question is, should we still be holding such importance on direct actions when we've seen far too often that it is in fact these direct actions that are causing these regions to fall into a state of instability where many of these atrocities can then flourish in these states? We see it, in Iran and Syria, and even to some extent with Israel or the Israelis and the West Bank and all that. And my other question, just sort of a follow-up, was at what point do the sort of international interests and international policies, when do they sort of encroach on the specific nation's own individual ability to make laws, like their own specific sovereignty? And just sort of in that sense, is that while direct action obviously is necessary, is it more important to go through more of a diplomatic and humanitarian channel, or is this still direct military action still required to reset balance?
Who's brave?
I think you raise an interesting point. I think the premise, I guess, tell me if you think I'm wrong with this, is that because we intervened in Libya and the backlash from that by Russia and China has led to their stymie action in Syria. Many people have actually made an argument, but I'm wondering whether or not it is another way of Russia, as we see today, basically saying we want to hold our own interests at all costs, regardless of what the consequences are. I mean, there's no doubt that Russia, in particular, maybe not China, essentially was defending the Assad regime because of its interest in Syria, including the support that they have in Syria. And that's where I think action should have been taken at that earlier stage, to actually focus on Russia's underlying intentions in Syria. And I'm on record as saying that Obama should have intervened at a very early stage, at least had a no-fly zone so that the moderate rebels could have basically had a better chance of winning. But now, you're right, now because of the lack of action and because of the implosion in Syria, everyone's saying perhaps Atrocity is dead. I don't believe it. I don't think any of my colleagues ever believe it. But it needs to be looked at. And in the research that I've done, it's very critical to look at sequencing and look at proportionality in terms of what areas of the world need intervention, keeping in mind exactly what you said, the potential consequences of actually having less positive results than if you didn't intervene.
Just on the questions, I'm glad the first question on the dangers of states-sponsored denial of genocide. Actually, I had that in my remarks, but I already felt I had gone on too long. I left it out, so I'm glad that it was brought up, because whether we're talking about Armenia or whether we're talking about the Holocaust or whether we're talking about Rwanda, we've had this ongoing experience of genocide denial. And as part of remembrance and action, we have to combat this genocide denial, because it very often descends into the blaming of the victims themselves, as when it is said that the Holocaust was a hoax, or that the Rwandan genocide never happened, and so on. I think we each have a responsibility to speak on behalf of those who cannot be heard, and to bear witness on behalf of those who cannot testify, and to act on behalf of those who've put not only their livelihood but their lives on the line. So that is a very important dimension, the combating of genocide denial. The second on Raoul Wallenberg and the importance of remembrance, I think that the Israeli government, I myself was one of those who felt that they had not done enough in acknowledging and remembrance, and did speak and complain about it. I will say that in 2012, on the centenary of Raoul Wallenberg, Yad Vashem held a full-day symposium on the importance and legacy of Raoul Wallenberg. That doesn't mean that more still needs to be done there. And as in other countries where Wallenberg is an honorary citizen and may not be doing enough. And the third thing on the direct action, and that brings up the whole question really of R2P as well. And I think we have to appreciate that R2P has a threshold and also a recommendation for action if that threshold is reached. The threshold is if in any country there are being committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, or God forbid, a genocide, and the country in which it is being committed is unwilling or unable to act, or worse, as is often the case, is the actual author of that international criminality, then it cannot hide behind any shield of state sovereignty. The responsibility to protect kicks in, and that has both procedural as well as substantive features. And responsibility to protect doesn't mean necessarily direct military action. That's a last resort. And for that resort, there are procedural responsibilities such as the UN Security Council authorization and the like. But certainly, in the case of Syria at the beginning, and I fully concur with what Errol said, there were things that could have been done there, in humanitarian corridors, no-fly zones, refugee relief, etc., and they were not done. And then we ended up with what we have ended up now. That began, as I said, with a very peaceful civil protest. It has become, unfortunately, a tragedy in which right now there are no good options. Had we acted initially, we might have prevented some of the tragedy.
I'll be quick because I do have to leave. Just concur on the whole issue of denial and the culture of denial can set in quickly. And frankly, you're also dealing with a culture of ignorance. And so we have to be vigilant to make sure that people don't forget not only the most recent horrific humanitarian crises or crimes against humanity or genocides, but also what's happened in the past. Because as generations go forward, there is, it can become fragile, the understanding. So we have to, it's also fighting a culture of ignorance. I want to just touch on the R2P, and I want to also point to a document that was put together, and a very important one, in collaboration with the All-Party Group. It was Nick's, Kyle's group. It's the will to intervene. So kind of changing the language, because many have noted that the R2P was misunderstood, and I will cite out Tony Blair for doing that when he used it as a premise for the invasion of Iraq. And it really undermined the whole credibility of R2P. People should understand it's multidimensional. So it means that right now, the debate we're having around Iraq, my view is the R2P is do what I was asked to do when I was on the ground with Minister Baird, and that is a rapid response to the humanitarian crisis of 1.8 million people who've had to flee their homes immediately. They're still waiting for us to respond as we debate whether or not, debate what we should do, or not be clear about what we're doing. For me, that's wrong. We should be able to have a clear policy that when we're asked to, as I was asked with Minister Baird, to have a quick response to help save lives immediately, we'd be there. R2P is also about Ebola. We have vaccines that somehow we can't figure out how to get to West Africa. I don't understand that. But we can get ammunition from Albania to northern Iraq. Finally, mentioned, and this is a difficult issue, the West Bank. I mean, this summer was a very difficult summer. And I did have comments and criticisms of the government, of our government and Mr. Netanyahu about the way in which they responded. And of course, I always have to say about condemning what Hamas is doing. But when you see in the ways in which it was dealt with, what about who speaks for those civilians? And where is the responsibility to protect in that frame?
And we should have a discussion about that, which is a very difficult one. It's a hugely difficult one. God knows I know it. You know, I had my office occupied over it this summer. And it requires intelligent responses and to be consistent. On really, we're talking about the people who are affected, who have no voice, and that's what I said in my comments. Not about the various parties involved in conflicts, but what about the people who are affected? And I think it should be raised, and it should be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Paul. I really apologize to both of you waiting for questions. We have to finish a bit early because both Paul and Erwin have to be on Parliament Hill. If you have questions, you can email them to me and I can send them to them and maybe get them on our website. I want to thank everyone for coming here today. I want to thank our speakers for taking time out of their schedule. And please, if you have any friends in Montreal or Toronto, we're going to be doing several other events in the next month. Thank you.